Hi everyone, this is Christine from 1301. So today in this video we're going to be learning about Python classes and OOP, which stands for Object-Oriented Programming. So far you guys have already worked with a couple of Python classes. So you've worked with strings and ints and lists and dictionaries and so on and so forth. So those are all different classes that are built into Python. But today we're going to talk about object-oriented programming, which is where you as the coder can create your own objects and define what they are and what they can do. Every object in Python or every class in Python has its own attributes and methods. So you can think of those as kind of like properties of an object and the capabilities that an object might have. So let's start out with just a little drawn example. So let's say we have this baker, and this baker is going to have a name, the name of the bakery he works at, and then a list of recipes that he knows how to make. So we'll just start this baker off and we'll say his name is Josh. The bakery he works at is going to be called the Cake Shop. And since he's just starting out, let's just make the recipes that he knows an empty list. So he doesn't know any recipes yet. Okay, so we can open a new idle window and we can just start coding this very simple example. So to start coding your own custom class, you start off with the keyword class, which turns orange to let you know that you're typing a keyword, and then you're going to type the name of the class. So I'm going to call it Baker. So the first thing you need to do to make your own class is you need to code the init function, which stands for initialization. To do that, we just start off like any other function, but then we type underscore underscore, so it's two underscores, init underscore underscore, and then in here we're going to put our parameters. So in every object-oriented programming function or method, we're going to have self as the first parameter. So this just lets Python know that this init function is going to be acting on itself, if that makes sense. I think this will make sense a little bit later as we go into other functions. But anyway, we're going to start off with self, so that always needs to be there in an OOP method. And then we're going to put in parameters that we want to define when we're creating a baker object. So for now, we can just start off and say name and bakery. Okay. So when we're assigning these attributes to a baker object, we just need to say self.name equals name. And so what that does is it assigns the whatever value for name that you passed in this parameter to the baker's .name attribute. And so you do the same thing with bakery. And then we can do one more thing. So we can actually make an attribute that wasn't defined in the parameters. So we mentioned over here that each baker has a list of recipes that he knows. So we're going to say self.recipes, and let's just start it off as an empty list, just for every baker. So you can see that this recipes parameter wasn't actually defined in our set of parameters up here, but that's fine. So now we can save this, and when we run it, we can go ahead and actually create Josh, our baker. So we'll name this baker Josh, and all you have to do to use the init function over here is just type in, and you'll see Python actually gives you that pop-up to kind of help you remember what parameters are needed. You just type in the name, so we'll put Josh, and the bakery can be the cake shop. So now we can do a couple of things. We can actually take a look at what attributes this baker object was initialized with. So we can do something like print josh.name, and that'll show you Josh. We can print josh.bakery, and that'll give you the cake shop. And then we can also do print josh.recipes. So that's going to be an empty list right now, as we said. And then let's see what happens when we print type Josh. So you can see it says class main baker, so that kind of gives you a hint that you're doing the right thing, or like that you're on the right track. So the final thing we can do is we can actually print Josh directly, and you can see this gives you like a kind of unhelpful memory location in your computer. So to change that and to make it more useful, we can actually write something called the repr function. So what that does is it looks kind of like the init function. You have two underscores and then repr, which stands for representation, and then we just put self as the parameter. So what we can do here is we can return any string representation of the baker object that we want. For the baker object, let me just say I want to know the baker's name, where the baker works, and then how many recipes this baker knows how to make. So we can do something like this. Return my name is blank, and I work at blank, and then I know blank recipes. So when we're doing string formatting, we can just insert self.name. So you need that self in there because that kind of helps Python know which object you're talking about. So self.name, and then in the second blank we want the bakery, so self.bakery, and then in this last blank we want the number of recipes. So we're going to do length of self.recipes. So we can save this and open up the shell again. And so if we just make Josh again, just like we did before, and now we print Josh, it'll say, my name is Josh, I work at the cake shop, and I know 0 recipes. So that is a little bit more helpful than this memory address that we got before. Another thing that's important, obviously, in a baker example is we want different recipes, right? So we can do something like this. Let's imagine we have a couple of things. We'll have like a cake, and we'll give it a name. So we'll say red velvet cake, and then another attribute it can have is like a list of ingredients. So let's make it just a list of strings, very simple, and then we'll put flour, eggs, food coloring. I'm sure I'm missing some really important ingredients, but that's fine. So let's just say these are the 3 things that go into red velvet cake. And then we'll also make another one. Let's just call it cake pop. So we'll say name is cake pop, and then ingredients, we'll just say cake crumbs and frosting. Okay, so let's think about how we might go about making this recipe class in Python. So we can come out of this indentation for the baker class and we can make a new class outside of it. So we can just say class recipe, and then we can say init and then self, name, and ingredients. So obviously the structures of these 2 functions are going to look really similar because they're just your basic initializing functions. And so we do the same thing, self.name equals name, and then self.ingredients equals ingredients. So you can see that unlike in the baker initialization function, we don't have any attributes here that aren't listed in the parameters. So we have, when we're making a recipe, we give it the name and we give it the ingredients, and that's just all of the attributes that we need. So when you're making your own objects, it's kind of up to you what parameters you want to require in your initialization function and which attributes you want to just make without having them to be declared in the function header. So we can just go ahead and write a representation function for this as well, just to make it easier on ourselves. So we can just do something like blank is a dish made with blank ingredients. So pretty simple. And then we'll format that with self.name and the length of self.ingredients. Okay, so let's run this again, and then we'll just make a couple of recipes. So just like the examples that we drew, we'll just go ahead and write red velvet cake equals recipe, and then again it shows you this little pop-up which attributes you need to declare. So we'll say red velvet cake, and we'll do a list. So flour, eggs, and food coloring. Okay. So now if you print red velvet cake, you can see it says red velvet cake is a dish made with 3 ingredients. And so we can go ahead and make cake pop as well. So we can call it cake pop, and then the ingredients are cake crumbs and frosting. And then we can print cake pop, and then it'll give us this string representation, which is exactly what we expected. So you can go ahead and print out the type of any one of these recipe objects, and as expected it says main recipe. So this is like one of your other custom classes. Okay, So now we have our baker class and we have our recipe class, and we want them to be related somehow. So let's say we want Josh to know how to bake red velvet cake and cake pop. So how do we add these recipe items into Josh's recipes attribute? So that's pretty simple. We can just write another function. We can go into our baker class and we can write a function called learn recipe. And so all this function is going to do is it's going to take in some recipe object and add it to the baker's recipes attribute. So we need self because this is inside the baker class. So we are telling Python that this learn recipe function is acting upon this baker object. And then we're also going to put in a recipe object. So all we need to do is say self.recipes.append recipe. So that will access the list that acts as the baker's recipes attribute and then just append the recipe to it. So it's pretty simple. So if we run that again, let's go ahead and make Josh, make red velvet cake, and make cake pop. And now we can see that when we print Josh, he knows 0 recipes right now. So what we can do is we can say josh.learn recipe, and then we can add red velvet cake inside this further parameter. So now when we print Josh, it'll say, my name is Josh, I work at the cake shop, and I know 1 recipe, which is exactly what we were expecting. So just to double check that we got the right one in there, we can say print josh.recipes, and it'll give you this list with the string representation of the 1 recipe he knows, which is red velvet cake is a dish made with 3 ingredients. So we can do the exact same thing. We can say josh.learn recipe cake pop. And then now when we print josh.recipes, he has 2 string representations of recipe objects. He has red velvet cake and cake pop. So that's a basic way to connect 2 custom objects that you make. So now let's code a method in the baker class that will return true if a baker knows how to make a certain recipe and false if he doesn't know how to make a certain recipe. Okay? So all we have to do is let's make a function called canBake, and we're going to do self and recipe as the parameters again. So all we need to do is figure out whether this recipe is in this baker's self.recipes, and if so, we're going to return true, and if not, we're going to return false. So all we need to do is say if recipe in self.recipes, return true, and else return false. So what that's doing is just using this in keyword to check if whatever recipe we pass in as the parameter is inside this baker's list of recipes. Okay? So let's just remake all of these baker objects and recipe objects, and let's also make another recipe object called apple pie. So it's going to be called apple pie, and it's going to have pie crust, apples, and cinnamon as its ingredients. So let's have Josh learn the recipes for red velvet cake and cake pop. So when we print his recipes, he has 2 recipes in there, but he doesn't know apple pie. So when we do josh.canBake red velvet cake, Python will check to see if red velvet cake is in Josh's recipes, and it'll return true. But then we can also do josh.canBake for apple pie, which we didn't teach him, and it'll say false. Now we've coded 2 methods that deal with bakers and the recipes that they know or might not know. So now let's write some functions to compare 2 bakers. So we have Josh, and we have these 2 recipes, but what if we add a couple of new bakers to the mix? So let's make another baker, and let's name this baker Ari. And let's say that she works at 678 Bakery. And then, of course, she's going to start off with a blank list of recipes, just like the initialization function states. And then we're going to make another one, and we'll just name this baker Jason, and he can work at the cake shop along with Josh. And then the recipes obviously are nothing. Okay? So let's go ahead and come into our coding example, and let's code these 2 bakers. So, we can make Ari, and she's a baker with the name Ari, and then she works at 678 Bakery. And then Jason will be another baker, his name is Jason, and he works at the cake shop. Okay, so now what we need to do is we want to code a function. We'll call it isCoworker, and it's going to take in self, obviously, and let's say other baker is our other variable. So that's going to represent whatever other baker object that we're passing in as a parameter. So we want to check if these two baker objects, self and other baker, work at the same bakery. So all we need to do is say if self.bakery equals other baker.bakery, then return true, else return false. So that's pretty straightforward. We can go ahead and restart the shell, and let's just make these bakers all over again. Josh, Ari, and Jason. So when we do Josh.isCoworker with Jason, it'll give us true because they both have the cake shop as their bakery. But when we do Josh.isCoworker Ari, it's going to say false because they don't have this same string for their bakery attribute. All right, so let's write one more function that compares two bakers. So let's make one that just figures out which recipes two bakers have in common. So if you want, you can pause here and try to do it on your own and then restart the video and see if you get it right. So we'll just call it recipes in common, and it's going to take in self and some other baker variable, so we'll call it other baker. So this one's maybe a little bit more complex than these other ones that we've made, especially these ones that just return a Boolean value. So what we can do is we can start off and we'll say common recipes, and we'll make it an empty list. And now we can iterate through all of the recipes in self and then check to see if that recipe is in other baker's recipe attribute. So we can say for recipe in self.recipes. So this is going to be referencing all of these recipe objects inside the self.recipes list for the baker. And we can say if recipe in other baker.recipes, we're going to append it to this common recipes list. Okay, and else just don't do anything. And so at the end, we can just return the common recipes list. Let's run this in the shell. We'll make, let's just say we'll make Josh and Ari, and then we'll make red velvet cake, cake pop, and apple pie. Okay, so let's make Josh learn recipe red velvet cake. Let's make Ari learn that one as well. And then let's also have Josh learn cake pop. And then we'll have Ari learn apple pie. So right now we can just go ahead and print each of the recipes. So Josh knows red velvet cake and cake pop, and Ari knows red velvet cake and apple pie. So when we run this recipes in common function, we expect to just see red velvet cake in the list that gets returned. So let's go ahead and do it. We'll say Josh.recipes in common with Ari, and then you can see it just returns a list with red velvet cake. Okay, so that's one example of a way that you can compare two instances of the same custom object. In this case, we're doing two baker objects, but we can code a couple of functions that compare two types of recipes to each other. So we can write a very similar function to recipes in common, but we can do ingredients in common. So we can do self and then other recipe. So pretty much the same general theme. So make a list of common ingredients, then for ingredient in self.ingredients, if ingredient is in other recipe.ingredients, common ingredients dot append ingredient. So it's pretty much exactly the same, you just change some of the variable names. So now you can return this list. So we can take a look and see what this might look like. Let's say we'll make pumpkin pie. Pumpkin pie. and we'll have pie crust, cinnamon, and pumpkin as the ingredients. So now we can do apple pie dot ingredients in common with pumpkin pie. And so you can see it gives us pie crust and cinnamon. Another thing about this is it actually doesn't make a difference which object you put in front. So you can do pumpkin pie ingredients in common with apple pie and it'll give you the exact same results. So don't worry about that. Anyway, hopefully this video has covered pretty much all you guys need to know about OOP, at least the basics. And yeah, thank you for watching.